Oh boy, sure is good to be back on the patio after a busy day at A Minor Diner with my main man, the one, the only, the treble chef, Jesse.
I don't have many things in this life, but I love nothing more than being out here with the base chef, Zach, on the A Minor Diner patio.
Because, boy, it was a busy day. You know how many dishes we had to remake today because people just kept complaining? There were just little things wrong.
They sent one back, and I swear we did it 3 times. And
I know. It feels like we did it 3 times.
Refried.
God.
Losing all value whatsoever.
Just all value. It was nothing by the time it came out.
Yeah.
So after a busy day, it's just so good to come out here and just sit in complete silence. No, I hate this.
No, this sucks. This is like my least favorite part of the night. Yeah,
let's find somebody to talk to.
Yeah, I was looking in that eternal silence. We actually have the muralist. He's still out here on the side of the building.
Yeah, so we're commissioning a mural on the side of A Minor Diner, right by the pool.
It's fine. We're working on it. We're pumping out the water from the parking lot. It's a parking lot, please. But
well, let's call him over. I haven't met the dude yet.
Yeah, come on.
I haven't even glanced in his direction.
Yeah, you over there. Yes, the people yelling. Head over this way.
Drew Button.
Whoa, Zach, Jesse, what are you guys doing here?
We are A Minor Diner. We own the place. We operate the place.
Oh my gosh, this is okay. So it wasn't you that I talked to with the commission here, but that's so awesome. This is such a great place.
Crazy. That must have been Mandy, and she doesn't tell us anything.
Yeah, our agent or somebody dumb. We're firing them, whoever it was.
Oh, it's so good to see you guys. I mean, it's been a long time. How are things going?
Oh, they're great. I mean, we're just working on things. We got all sorts of construction projects. Everything's going perfectly fine.
Yeah, there's no pool.
No, it's not a pool. It's a parking lot.
A parking lot? Right here? This? Over the water?
Yes. We hit an aquifer. It is not a big deal. I don't understand the appeal of this, but yes, it's a parking lot. We're expanding.
Gotcha.
What have you been up to, Drew Button?
Oh, man. About 7 months ago, I started working for myself as an artist. I've been busy with a lot of different projects. I mean, murals among them, graphic design, branding. I'm working on a book right now with a friend of mine. We're illustrating a novel. It's really a pretty big variety of work. So it's been fun.
No, that's great. I mean, we've actually known Drew for quite a while, and he's kind of been our resident artist. And I'm glad that you're now you're on our payroll, I guess now.
Oh, totally.
It begs the question, though. I know you're more like you kind of specialize in all different forms of art, but you've kind of brought this gigantic 3D form of art, and I have to ask you about this 10-ton equestrian statue that you've so eloquently pushed onto our balcony or on patio here.
Oh, yes. I meant to say that in an email before I showed up today, but I'll move it. It's really heavy. Actually, this is a bronze statue of Juan de Oñate, which I'm not sure you've ever heard of him, but sort of an important figure in New Mexican history, and he was a Spanish conquistador.
Interesting. I think we've actually been looking for something like this for a meal. I think this would work pretty well for a meal.
This is a perfect meal. We can make a nighttime meal out here.
It is a bit cramped, I'll give you that, but I think that we got a lot to cook with here.
Oh, totally. I mean, there's actually an interesting story that goes along with this sculpture, this statue. You'll notice he's missing his right foot.
Oh. Yes, you're right. Did you do that? Artistic choice?
No. Actually, it was like that. So the story goes that Juan de Oñate, he arrived some 400 years ago, Spanish conquistador. He became sort of the George Washington of, the new Spanish settlements in New Mexico in a lot of ways. You see his name. You see his depiction in a lot of areas of New Mexico, and he's kind of an important figure, sort of considered, one of the founding fathers. So they have erected the statue to him, and then it happened, the statue was made, and then it happened that one of the members of the Acoma Pueblo, which is a settlement of Native Americans that have been here for a long time. It's actually the longest continuously inhabited settlement in North America and what is now the United States.
Oh, wow.
Sort of made a statement recently by removing Oñate's foot and leaving a letter on the desk of one of the local journalists saying, I have Oñate's foot. I plan to melt it down and return it as, sell it as medallions to the historically ignorant.
Which is super metal, if I must say.
Literally.
Wonderful.
But yeah, so the foot thing is symbolic, right? So Oñate, controversial figure. You could say he made some oopsies.
I had a couple sketchy moments along the way.
Sketchy moments is one way to put it. You could also call it a massacre. Massacre also works in this situation. So 1598, Oñate and his boys, the boys, they come up.
The hermanos, yes.
Yeah. Los Hermanos come up from Mexico and end up, in New Mexico, make a new settlement in New Mexico. And only 1 year later, it doesn't take that much time, leads to something called the Acoma Massacre. So basically, some of the boys, they're traveling through the area and come across some Acoma natives, and they say, well, we are traveling. That wasn't really an accent. We're traveling here, and we need some cornmeal and we need some blankets. Please, thank you, and you're welcome. And the natives say, no, we're gonna keep them. We're gonna keep them for ourselves. Leads to a little tiff. A few Spanish soldiers are killed in the tiff, I guess, and one of them is a relative of Oñate. So he says that there's a quote that he's going to bring, fire and blood to the Acoma Indians, and it ends up 800 to 1,000. Numbers are sketchy, but 800 to 1,000 Acoma people murdered, massacred.
And to such a degree in this incident that even as far as 1500s, 1600s atrocities go, the king says, yeah, I don't think we're going to have you over there anymore. Come on back and I'll appoint you head of mining or whatever he ended up doing. But a pretty substantial, where the old world meets the new world, both historically and geographically, a very flashpoint incident. Yeah.
So in that massacre, as it's coming to an end, the men that have survived their fellow community members are sentenced to slavery to Oñate and also sentenced to have their right foot removed. Hence, the member of the Acoma Pueblo now removing the foot from this statue here to remind people of that massacre and sort of, have people face that question of why do we have statues of Oñate? Who is Oñate, and what did he do? Because that type of story can be forgotten over time.
Because what is the argument for having an Oñate statue? Why, if he's clearly known as being this atrocious murderer, essentially, why even erect this in the first place?
Known as a terrible murdering human being, but he also kind of, I guess, introduced a lot of the culture that is still there in New Mexico. New Mexico is a really interesting part of the United States in terms of cultural mixing, I guess. And yeah, brought so the guy who sculpted the statue, his name is Reynaldo Riviera, and he says, this is a fun quote from that guy. He says, "Sure, Oñate wasn't a saint," which is one way to put it. But you can't put aside what the Spanish brought: the horse, the pig, the sheep, the cow, wine, and the mining industry. So I think that's fine with me. Let's put up the murderer statue. He brought cows.
Cast the mold and let's build a podium for this guy. Yeah, that's a very because especially Drew, like you're saying, that he chops off the feet of this like generation or generations of these people. It's like a very because Spain is very obviously colonial, but they're also on this Catholicist bent and of trying to proselytize and get things out there, and that's a very like biblical sort of punishment, almost like the Pharaoh in Exodus to try to handicap or just remove the ability for these people to ever for generations like rebel or fight back or protect themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting too. This happened at a time when New Mexico and the community of Albuquerque was about to celebrate the Cuarto Centenario of, which is the 400-year anniversary of Juan de Oñate's grand arrival, and this was meant to ruin the party, sort of. I mean, it was. That was why he did it. It was like, hey, we're about to have Juan de Oñate's 400th birthday. I'm going to chop his foot off and sell it as medallions. That's going to really bother some people, but it's also going to like bring this conversation back to the surface at a time in our country when we're having a similar conversation around other monuments. So with that, City of Albuquerque put out another public art commission to, there was money granted to artists to create another public art installation on this Cuarto Centenario. So they came up with yet another Juan de Oñate statue, which bothered some people. So they invited another artist, Nora Naranjo Morse, who is a member of the Tewa tribe and represented the people of the Acoma Pueblo, to kind of create this sort of tricultural collaboration between Native people, Spanish Americans, and Anglo Americans, so that there would be kind of this seemingly evenly distributed collaborative process that represented the interests of all three cultural groups. And the design was presented, and Nora rejected it based on the fact that this in this composition is still Oñate on a horse and on a granite pedestal. And the design team said, Nora, you can have the pedestal to work with as your part of the project. And she said, not in a million years. And then it was, the Spanish Americans part of the project that said, well, Oñate is non-negotiable. He has to be a part of this composition. This is about him. This is the 400th anniversary. and the argument there being that this is public art. This is public art that's funded publicly. So it's taxpayer money. And who are the taxpayers? They are people with, ancestral ties to Acoma. There are people with ancestral ties to Spain. And there are Chicanos and mestizos and white, black. It's a really diverse community. So what composition can be agreed upon that is going to sort of satisfy and represent everyone's interest? And what they ended up doing is kind of breaking it into two. So you still have this bronze sculpture of Oñate, followed by not only, Spanish settlers, but native people. You get the cow and the pig and the sheep.
Yes,
and
I was hoping for that.
Yes.
Bated breath. I was hoping they were there.
And then you have Nora's piece of the project where she decided to create a land work, and she developed this sort of spiraling landform that kind of is made of and descends into the desert itself, and in its own way tells the journey and kind of the origin story of the people of Acoma. So, when she talks about it, she says, we came here on the back of Grandmother Spider, and we arrived at the Acoma Pueblo, and she told us that this is where we belonged. And to me, that's as much of an origin story as Juan de Oñate guiding his people to this land. So,
and that sort of begs, I guess, the question, because I guess I have 2 points for this overall point, that how a community chooses to represent itself or who they choose to hold up above others, not necessarily in terms of more rights, but in memory of, because inherently a statue is on a pedestal to some degree. You look up to it. And there's this statue at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City of Teddy Roosevelt riding a horse, just like Oñate. And on one side of him is a Native American man, sort of not looking displeased, but not looking pleased, aiding the future president. And then on the other side is an African American man, again, at his like waist level because Teddy's on the horse. And the museum is fine with getting rid of it. The city wants to get rid of it. The people want to get rid of it. The Roosevelts are like totally great with getting rid of it, but it's not happening. And I think because of the general bureaucratic process because it is taxpayer funded art. And I know like the three of us grew up watching the statue of Saddam get toppled. And so there is a general, that's almost metaphorical, of the power vacuum that happened over there. If you change things instantly and too quickly, it can destabilize it. But it just reminds me, like you're bringing up the overall American debate over statues of who gets to be a statue and not, obviously centered on Confederate soldiers and generals. And it reminds me, like around this time last year, we were having like a family gathering just beyond my, parents and brother and I with the rest of the family arguing about these statues, or they were talking about these statues. And there's the usual talking points of this is history and this is our culture.
We're forgetting history.
Yeah, we're going to just demolish our history and then forget who we are and, have to refile for Social Security and look at our birth certificate to figure our names. But there's all these arguments on both sides of that of like, well, they could maybe be in a museum, blah, blah, blah. As a side point, this Oñate statue is from the early 90s. It is not a 300-year-old statue. They did it quite a bit later. But then there's this moment, like you love your siblings and you love them when you're young and then your teen years and 20 years or whatever relationship you have with your siblings. But for me in my 20s, this was like a reminder, oh, this is my brother. This is the young man that I love. When the conversation eventually got around to us, like, boys, what do you think about these statues? My brother just sort of piped up, well, first off, no one should have a statue of them, like, period. Like, this is, like, the end of story. And that sort of got me thinking, that, like, other than, like, a mythological, biblical, fictional character or an animal, like a pig or a cow, that would be great.
We need that Babe statue now.
Wilbur.
Charlotte's Web, yeah.
Wilbur, Babe, yeah, all of them. Is there ever like a context in which, like, why do we need these statues? There's statues everywhere all over the world, but especially in America, why build an Oñate statue? Why do we choose to define ourselves in these sorts of ways and then get offended? Why does some contingency get offended with the prospect of removing that symbol?
Well, because it's this interesting thing, right, is that people, they're all making that same argument that you brought up, that it's like, well, we're tearing down our history. But, like, I challenge you to think about, like, one statue that you have seen in your entire life that, like, made you seriously reflect on, like, a historical event. Like, are you learning history through these bronze statues? Are you?
To your point, the only one I can actually think of now that I think about it, at the beginning of the movie Balto, there's a statue of Balto, the dog, the real dog. And so that dog that helped deliver the medicine up in Alaska, that deserves a statue because that dog was just, it didn't ask for that, but it did its noble duty. But other than Balto...
that dog killed 0 natives.
Yes,
too.
exactly. Yes. He's like +1 life, if anything. So I would say Balto is the only thing. And if that's our standard, then no one is meeting that. No.
No, that's a great question. And when you ask that of yourself too, it's like, I can't think of anything. I mean, I used to ride my bike past the front steps of the Colorado State Capitol every day, and there was a statue there that is gone now. It was a statue of a Civil War figure.
Somebody that was
Somebody.
there. 11 years later after the state, the state wasn't even founded at that time, but yeah.
So it's interesting, and honestly, it's a really materialistic way of thinking about parts of our history and the stories of the people involved in the making of this country. So, I mean, when you start talking about your family, I think about that in such a way that is like, what Ryan has a point. Like, should there be any sculptures if we can't do it in such a way that we don't sort of develop these really unrelenting emotional ties to something that is so materialistic. Like, my partner Emily and I have this discussion many times as we're trying to purge our 650 square foot house of anything so that we have room to walk around.
I know the feeling out here on this patio with this giant statue.
This is really crowded.
Yes, yes. We can really empathize.
I promise I'll move the statue before too long. But, you know, one of the conversations came up when I was having trouble letting go of a side table that I had inherited from my great-grandmother. And, you know, she posed the question to me very plainly, well, do you think your great-grandmother would like to be remembered by this side table? And when she put it that way, I was like, well, no, I don't think so, you know. And then I'm like, well, what can I remember her by? And I think of these journals that she kept daily. That my mom at home has this crockery full of these journals that my grandmother kept, and she'd write a couple sentences each day, and you know, it was something super simple and just, you know, the paces of ordinary life. Like, raccoon got into the tomatoes, you know, the boys were out playing in the yard and one of them cut their leg. You know, Kathy had a skinned knee after school today, and it rained, and tomorrow it's going to be, you know, too soggy to get out into the fields. And you read that, and it has a date on it. You know, it says, you know, June 14th, 1968 or something like that. And you're like, wow, I got these chills thinking, I'm like, this is this little sepia tone window into this part of my family's story. In the same way, it's like, how can we do that with our public spaces? How can we do that with all the stories that make up the fabric of this country?
Yeah, and I think that's, to your point, like, it's not nostalgic, but like inherently a human being, even the best, even Balto has his flaws. And so
barely.
I won't take any Balto slander in this restaurant.
I will not take it.
But like, people have their faults, and I guess you can have like Michelangelo's David that's depicted in an interesting way that is a bit of an unorthodox take on David and Goliath. But otherwise, like, the modern statue is a bit too crude to depict like nuance, like you're saying. Like, you're not, like you're saying, Zach, like, what history do you actually learn from a statue? Because what is it able to convey other than like an inherent, like, subliminal, this value that I'm projecting to you is now like a chess piece of like, this neighborhood park, because it's this statue, we believe in X. And in the case of this, it's like
conquest.
Yes, Spain deserved the southwestern United States at the time.
Because it was interesting learning about the grandmother spider, the land art exhibit, which, like, I think presents an origin story in so much more powerful of a way. In that, you're actually getting to know some culture. You're getting some new kind of, like, new input, new way of seeing this area and like seeing these people. Whereas I don't think you ever get that from a statue. They're just such a plain, like, idolatrous monolith of a person that it's like, you can't present them in any sort of fault. It's just a bunch of people on horses. You're not getting anything out of it. And you're not learning. Like, there isn't really a history or a real history, because they're just presenting these people literally without faults, like carved into a metal to last forever, which, I don't know, it doesn't really say anything. There's like, you wonder why they exist in the first place, I guess.
Yeah, because you bring up like idol, and you go back to David, Michelangelo's David. That's an inherently Christian thing, like Greco-Roman, trying to spread Christianity and therefore the church's rule. That's not depicted that. It's not that he's vanquished Goliath. It's that he's about to go do it. And so it's a statue of like the beauty of courage or whatever. And you can project white supremacy and, you know, European dominance to it, but it's inherently that. Whereas they have some legitimate claim to say, okay, he did cultivate the culture of the Southwest by bringing animal husbandry and all of this into it. But then there's not really, like in the way you're saying, there's that sepia tone. People and supporters of him are choosing to see it that way. But if it's such a literal depiction of a man on a horse, that is also what they saw when they were being massacred. Like, it's like one of these, there's no room for nuance. And so then how do we go about transitioning from, let's build statues on every square inch of this country, like Rushmore basically is a good example, to, like you're saying, a more nuanced, what makes, because that's a beautiful story about the origin story of that, you know, with the mother spider. How do we transfer to that, basically?
That's a great question, and I think that's what we're starting to see happening, and especially just in this isolated project, is that you have both. You have the past, you have the traditional way of memorializing things, and it's with these really representational, only could be Juan de Oñate type of works, and then you have this experiencing the story, learning about the people through the landscape, through something that is experiential that you pass through, and maybe in the same way that people would have passed through, you know, this threshold from, you know, the past life into this life or something like that, you know. And we're seeing it even with, you know, places like the 9/11 memorial. It's so important. Like, if you ask yourself, you know, what is the right approach to this? And
exactly.
The design team did. They spent 11 years on it, you know, and now you have these massive fountains that are these cavities, these holes in the ground. You watch this water descend into these pits. It feels like the water is moving towards the center of the earth, and, you know, its perimeter is this steel plate with the names in it. And so you approach this and you ask yourself, oh my gosh, if we had tried to imagine this memorial in the way that we always have with bronze sculptures, like, what does that become? Like, who do you depict? Is it,
because who would be the single person? Like, you know, you can't do Bush or Giuliani or anything like that.
No.
But
It's
like
Rudy Giuliani. It's Dick Cheney. We get a big Dick Cheney out there.
well, and I heard a story recently about this heroic, you know, this heroic civilian story where there was a blind man that was working in one of the towers, and his guide dog led him out of the building, and I'm like, make a bronze statue out of that dog.
Yes,
like,
more dog statues. Yes.
but still, that is only one part. That's
Yes.
only one piece, and it's like, you know, whether it's the firefighters or the police officers or these civilian heroes or anything else like that, it still isn't doing. It's not creating this visceral experience where people have to ask questions or they can feel what that place has to offer. It's like, all you can do is look at the statue, you know?
Yeah, because it's almost to that point. It's not even like a communist thought, but like, what event in history could you boil down to one single person's selfless act? Very outrageously few. And so inherently, maybe that's the answer, is that if there has to be these things, it doesn't have to be a dog, but it could be someone who had that responsibility thrust upon them, rather than someone who ultimately is fallible and is not going to be agreeable to enough of the community that it's not a good thing to erect a totem to them, and we are represented by this sole figure.
Because I mean, that's the problem. Is like any piece of art is going to say something, whether that's intended or unintended. And that Oñate statue is saying certain things to you know, the Mexican American or Spanish Americans, and saying very different things to the native population in that area. So I don't know. It has me thinking about like the reasons for creating art and like intended and unintended consequences. And I actually have a movie it's kind of making me think of. And I have the movie in the kitchen. I've got it on 16 millimeter. So, Jesse, we still have that film projector, right?
We actually do. Yeah, let's go grab
You want to watch a movie?
That sounds great.
I brought a film called Elephant. Elephant 2003. The director is Gus Van Sant, who is famous for Good Will Hunting, more so than anything.
Yeah.
So he started kind of as like an experimental filmmaker, and with Good Will Hunting kind of becomes a Hollywood darling of sorts. So he does Good Will Hunting. He does
Finding Forrester.
Finding Forrester, and he does the Psycho remake, which we don't talk about.
That'll be an eventual day. Yes.
we forget that the Psycho remake ever happened. But then in 2003, he makes a film called Elephant, what's Elephant about?
Well, he gets his blank check. The studio's like, yeah, we love you with Good Will Hunting and Forrester, so what do you want to make a movie about? And he says, well, it's been a couple of years since Columbine, so I would like to do a school shooting movie.
Oh, wow.
And he does it, like you say, this is like right after Psycho. So Psycho's this weird, you know about this movie, and we're going to do a shot-for-shot remake of a movie that you all have already seen. But now
we love it, but we've got Vince Vaughn.
Yeah.
That's what's the real difference.
You know, from Swingers, he should play, the absolutely famous role. But he then says, okay, I'm going to lean back into where I came from, and we're going to go full. It's not literally cinema verite is known as like presenting like documentary style filmmaking, but he goes like, yeah, we're going to shoot it in a school with actual high school kids and make it very fly on the wall slice of life, not like a plotty movie. And takes it to Cannes, and Cannes for like, I think one of very, like maybe this is only the third time it's ever happened, wins Best Picture and Best Director, because they don't like to give the same thing to the same movies. They like to spread out the awards. And so it becomes this like, okay, the Good Will Hunting guy, we all love that, apples and applesauce or whatever the quote is in that movie.
I think the quote is just apples, applesauce.
How do you like them apples? That's right. And they're like, okay, we'll go see this movie, and it's Elephant, which is following kids around, very slow. If it takes 10 minutes to get from one classroom to the other, that's how long it takes, and all culminating in this very like frenetic, explosive violence. Drew, what did you think of Elephant?
I was pretty young when Columbine happened. And so at the beginning of the movie, I was waiting for it this whole time. And when I started to wonder, I'm like, is it elephant? Because there's this elephant in the room. There's this thing that we're waiting for. And you do feel that as you're following these students around, because there's these really long, these really beautiful continuous shots, uncut, where you follow these characters who, they're named throughout, and you kind of, you're like, what are we building towards? Who is it? Who's going to commit this atrocity? And you start kind of speculating a little bit in the beginning, but it felt very personal. You're close to these students like the whole time. You're following them. The shots are, I think the shots are beautiful because you get kind of this bokeh effect, if you will. The foreground, the subject is very in focus. The camera is like you're on their shoulder. You're looking at the side of their face. You're following them down the hallway or across the lawn or from the parking lot into the school, and you hear just ordinary sounds, and everything else is kind of a blur. So all you can focus on is this person. And just by doing that, without them saying anything or really doing anything significant, you attach to them in sort of a way. So it was hard for me to watch, to be honest.
It's a weird, because I remember I got this on DVD, and because there was like a Hollywood video closing or whatever, and I had always heard about Elephant. And so right now it's literally like on my shelf, like Paddington, Elephant, Paddington 2. And so it's like, because growing up in the same way, because we're all about the same age here at A Minor Diner tonight, and like Columbine is this insanely formative event for anyone who was, I don't want to say a 90s kid, but like literally you're in middle school or elementary school, that happens, and like the United States of America decides, okay, we need to start building schools in a different way, because you can't, like, that's a big relic of Elephant is there's no cell phones, and then this school has these insanely broadly open hallways, the doors, like everything about it is not what we built, because we all went to culinary high school together, And our school was built post Columbine and built for those like right angles, tight corners, so that you can't.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like psychologically a little bit like a prison of like, here's this foregone conclusion that in the event that this happens, because it's been happening a lot, here's how we deal with it architecturally. But yeah, like there's you mentioned the title. He has said that there's like that interpretation of the title, but then there's also this parable of like the five blind men and the elephant, and they're each like touching a different part of the elephant, and they can't even agree on what the animal is, because the one touching the trunk, that's such a different sensation than like the back leg, than the tusk, than the ears and everything. So it's like there's this one thing, but everyone has a very different interpretation of it. And like that, this was the first time I'd watched Elephant in like 10, 15 years. And I had forgotten about that there's every character in the movie, even if you took out the school shooting, has like an existential problem, like something that's like they're hurtling into like unbelievable body image issues, or like the movie opens with, you think this kid's going to be the killer. His dad is like drunk driving him to school, and really he is having to take care of his dad. And like the moment that resonated weirdly enough for me the most is there's that young woman who's in PE class, and she's very clearly not like all the other girls, and she won't wear the shorts and the short sleeves or whatever, because she's so self-conscious. And so she takes the unbelievably scenic route to get to the locker room, because she doesn't want to be in there undressing with them and be directly confronted with them making fun of her. And it's like this unbelievably heavy moment, and then you're like, oh right, sandwiched in between all of this are these little interstitials of by that point I think we've met the two shooters. We've at least seen them once entering the school, because it takes place over the course of one day, the film, and we see it from this character's perspective and this character, and it all sort of stops short of the moment of the shooting until you meet the two shooters.
Right, and it's really thoughtfully sort of folded back on itself, because you're looking at this day from the perspective of all these different students, and the scene kind of resets, or you start following someone different, where some of the characters cross and meet in the hallway, and there's kind of these benchmark moments, I guess, that I'll give it that name, where the first time it happens, you're like, oh, okay, so this is where we pick up with that person after that interaction happens. And it does look different each time you see the same moment. These two characters, Elias and John, I believe, they pass each other in the hallway a couple of times, and they have this kind of short banter, and Elias takes a photo of John, and he kind of slaps his hindquarter and is like, there you go, there's your picture. And he's like, how's your day going? Good. He's like, are you going to the concert tonight? No, my parents are being shitty this week. And he's like, oh, that happens, know. And that's it. But then you revisit that moment, I think, probably 4 times, maybe more. Because
that young woman is just running by to get to the library. And so she intersects right in that same moment. Yeah, and it's sort of very effective in that way of like the mundane. Because how was it for you guys watching it? Because I felt like, oh, right, I went to high school around this time. This is like, I haven't seen this depiction of high school since they invented the smartphone, basically. This is what it used to be.
Yeah, because so from everything from like the fashion to the look to the way that they're speaking, it's very 2003. It's very around the time that we were going to school, for sure. But I don't know. Okay, so you may be wondering why I brought these 16 millimeter films.
It is a cramped patio.
It is a cramped patio. Why did I bring these films out, especially in relation to this statue? Because it's not a particularly pleasant movie to watch. Like, it's not like a sit down with your significant other and just have like a really lovely movie night together kind of movie. But the reason that I brought them out, flashback to 2003. Okay, This is not. This is 4 years after the Columbine high school incident, and this is a different period of time, right? This is before we had like a weekly school shooting, you know? Like this is Columbine is still very fresh in people's memory. We haven't forgotten about it because there's just the other school shooting that happened 2 weeks later. This is like a very watershed moment in history, and people like families are still reeling from this. And Gus Van Sant decides to make a movie about it. And this is not like, so it's not just any school shooting. If you know something about Columbine, there's almost every similarity here that he is trying to make, from the majority of the shooting taking place in a library, from these guys setting explosives off that then later don't go off.
Exactly.
And playing Doom in their bedrooms. Like everything is meant for you to think about Columbine. That is the context for this film. But it's such a weird thing to me, because why does the movie exist? What is the point of introducing all of these characters that you sort of kind of get to know, but you never really get to know them that well, for 80 minutes, just walking around with these kids, these fictional characters, and then they get shot, and that's the end of the movie. And like, it's such a weird thing. We're talking about like the meaning of art and what deserves to be remembered. And I don't know. Like, what do you think about the kind of ethos of this movie even existing in the first place?
Well, because I agree basically almost entirely, because growing up, that being, because we all went to school like within an hour of Columbine, and so we're not ground zero, we're not Denver metro area, but we are at the time, you know, where we grew up. And that was something, using the word obsessed is a bad word, but like I was very fixated on like, who are these two people who, in the same sort of history brain thing, this is like when 9/11 happened, this is significant, and I want to know everyone on every sort of side. And like you said, it was very striking watching it again, because 10 years more of Columbine knowledge that's come out and things like that. He covers 95% of every facet of Columbine, of like, was it the fact that they gay lovers is even covered. And I remember watching this the first time and feeling that was so shoehorned in and out of place. But in reality, that is like it's not a credible theory, but it was a very big angle to the whole story. The only thing I will say before touching on that point, the only angle that I don't like about Elephant, specifically, of like, movies are a conversation piece and they exist to stimulate conversation, and as long as we're talking about it, then that's a good reason art should exist, to reignite that discussion. They order the guns off of a website in this movie, and that's like a very big flag that, like, okay, that doesn't actually exist. They're not going to get AR style weapons. In reality, in Columbine, they got them from people who were 18 years or older and bought them that way. But every other thing, exactly like you say, it's a bit like Black Hawk Down, or a lot of other movies that are about an event, or about a specific historical event, that almost becomes this weird, I don't want to single it out to just Americans, but it's this weird like torture porn kind of thing, where it's like, when are they going to make the Columbine movie, like specifically, or the Parkland movie, or the Virginia Tech movie? Like you say, it's happened a billion times since then, but at an increasing frequency. And it's this sort of like perverse, I do like the ambiguous stance it takes, but it is a weird, in any other like responsible movie, I would argue, responsible screenwriting or filmmaking movie, this would be the midpoint, if not the inciting incident, the school shooting. And it would be, how does the community deal with it, or even not deal with it, would be the move to make. But this one is like, there are many different sources. There's not one clear modus operandi or whatever you want to call it, like their reason for shooting up this school. But also, what are we supposed to do with that? Because that is evident in reality right now. And so, like you're saying, if art is to depict reality, that's great. But what's the perspective then, other than just, well, wouldn't it be, I want to scratch your curious itch to be in the library, which is a bit, not to take a moral stand, but a bit perverse, like to want to see that. So yeah, like Drew, what was in terms of what a movie is, in the many different art, movie, blockbuster, whatever, but like in what Elephant chooses to be, do you feel, how did you take it?
I took it as, and I don't know if Gus Van Sant intended for this, but I took it as a film to humanize these different types of students. And I thought it was interesting that we felt like we got one sample from each what I would call stereotypical group of high school student. We kind of open with the artist type. He seems to be this, amicable character that's liked by many and maybe not terribly noticed, but he passes people in the hallways and he's friendly to them and he's taking photos and he goes to the darkroom to develop his pictures. And you see the jock group and you see, maybe quote unquote the, kind of the language arts, debate group, and they're sitting around a table and they're talking about, how do you identify someone in public that's gay? And it sort of humanizes them in this way that, like, I'm back in high school. I'm remembering this. I'm remembering these conversations with people where I'm having these formative moments and I'm building relationships with people that in a way it's like, I think that's what he was trying to do. Like, let's forget the news media zoo. Let's forget how the community reacted, and like let's trim away everything but who these students were in their most ordinary and their most kind of like simply beautiful form. And it's hard because what happens. I mean, you're waiting for it the entire time, and it's like, yeah, you're right, it's not a movie that you sit and you put your arm around your significant other and get your popcorn and you're like, oh, let's watch Elephant. It's like I was sitting like hunched over in a hard chair with my hands kind of like clutching my chin the whole time. Mm-hmm. And I feel like this film exists to, and again, like this, I don't think this was writing on the wall. Gus Van Sant didn't know that our country was going to go through what it has gone through in the last 17, 18 years since it came out.
Yeah.
But you're sort of screaming. You're sort of screaming inside, especially when, the two shooters walk into the high school. You start screaming in your head, and you see that happen 3 more times because of the way that the story folds back on itself. But this film is to humanize the victims and also humanize the killers. I mean, and I don't want to say, the only reason I'm not saying demonize is because you do see them in sort of this troublesome way that they were living at home.
There's definitely almost like a sympathetic treatment of the two killers. It's not overwhelming. Like, it's not, the entire thing is not meant to be like a sob story about these two people. But so you say humanize, but then I don't know if you could really do spoilers, because you already know exactly what's going to happen in this movie. But there is like a pretty shocking moment when the shooting like actually starts, and the first person that gets shot, like, it's on screen, it's right there, and mostly they shy away from that actual like violence, I guess, in the film. It's mostly implied, but this, like, the first boom is not, and I don't know, I don't know, in the same way that Oñate, the statue, can bring up these kind of negative, for the ancestors of the people that Oñate killed, like these negative feelings that this exists, and this man is getting remembered for killing my ancestors. In the same way, is it just like voyeuristic and kind of evil to make this piece of art like refilming the death of a real human being in such a voyeuristic manner that you're actually, seeing this person, this fake, this actress, quote unquote, die.
Right. And I would say, because it sort of goes back to the Oñate thing where you can, it makes sense that there would be a statue at some point in history of him. And you could keep that statue around in the context of like changing opinions of him. And it's like, because I think, imagine this movie didn't come out, and then like 2 years ago was the 20th anniversary of Columbine, and so someone thought like, okay, I'm going to do my Columbine movie, but like literally did it as the story of Columbine. I think if they depicted, because like why I hone in on that gun thing where they just order the guns off of the computer is like, I do appreciate 90% of what he's doing of in the exact same way as Columbine. If you do like, okay, let's say they lived in a more gun controlled Denver in 1999, they're still going to put the propane bombs in the cafeteria in Columbine, and those aren't going to go off on April 20th, but no one cares in that school. Like no one's going around inspecting the bags, so they would get the bags back. If they didn't accidentally blow themselves up, they might try again on the 21st, 22nd, whatever. And then like there are many, many instances, because that's the big Columbine thing, is that Jefferson County dropped the ball so many times that they were arrested for breaking into a van like 2 or 3 years earlier. And okay, so if they were intercepted earlier with like mandatory psychiatric counseling, whatever kind of thing, like there's too many different angles that was like the perfect storm of like 1999 America, Colorado. I would say events like this, because it reminds me of like United 93 is that movie. It's a weird thing to do, because I know, like for example, Spielberg on Schindler's List took the bare minimum. The Directors Guild mandates that you take a minimum salary, like from the studio, so he couldn't do anything about that. But he took only that scale salary for Steven Spielberg, because he's like, well, I'm not going to make money off of the Holocaust. Like, it's a bit ridiculous, isn't it?
Interesting.
Yes, and so there is this weird. I appreciate how far off of like, it was this. They're overly medicated, or it's the guns, or it's the education system or whatever. I do appreciate how far off he gets, but then it's a weird he hasn't really, it's fallen out of the public eye, Elephant, quite a bit, and it's weird that it's done that despite the fact that it just keeps happening. And you'd think like when the pandemic hit, there was what's that Soderbergh movie, Contagion, like flared up and everyone started watching that again. So it's like, I guess a question to you guys of why are we not watching Elephant or at least talking about Elephant every month that this happens? If there is a school shooting movie that is pretty direct about not a school shooting happening in it, but about a school shooting, it's weird that the relevance of it, like every Memorial Day they'll play Saving Private Ryan. And I guess that's another example I would give, is like, should there be a D-Day movie? No, because it's a bit obscene and a bit absurd, but it's not about D-Day. D-Day takes place to establish the stakes in the first 10 minutes of the movie, and then they're done with that because it'd be a gore fest. I hadn't quite noticed. That's a very interesting take, that like there is only one instance of blood and gore, but it's cranked up to 10 out of 10.
It hurts too much. I think like when I was watching this movie and thinking about recent events, and especially like here in Colorado, I mean, we've had in the last couple of months, we had an incident at a grocery store in Boulder, and then the way that Gus shot this movie, and we've all been in a King Soopers, so it's like you can stitch together what that looks like, because you know what it looks like now. If you weren't imagining it before in the sort of visceral way that you follow these kids around this high school, you know how to now. Like, Gus gave you the tools to do that. It's too hard to watch. And like for these other events, they feel far enough in the past. World War II, these were things that our ancestors, our grandparents who've passed on now, that were visceral and real for them, and that's what this is for us. I start thinking about following the victim of a shooting through their normal day where they were just doing normal things, and it just abruptly ended. It hurts too much to watch it.
Yeah, because there's like what stuck out for me, those three young women who are, I think they're sophomores or juniors, because they're so ready to get out of high school and go to college, and they're talking about calories and grams of fat in their school lunches, and they just have this sort of, you can imagine those girls like that. They're not the most social and polite and kind to everybody, like that sort of archetype, like you're saying. And then there's a scene where they go to the bathroom, and then they all start throwing up, because they're throwing up their lunches to try to keep their figure. And like in this weird fly on the wall, you could have the whole movie without the school shooting, with like, it's just like, this is parents, this is what your kids are going through at school, like this is how they're being bullied, here's how they're bullying, here's how they're dealing with their girlfriend, and all these webs that intertwine, like you're saying. And I think it's almost, again, that weird product of its time. Like if this was on paper and they said, he's going to go make this movie, do you agree with this or not? I would agree with it on paper, because it's like parents at that point, boomers and Gen X parents, you don't really know what it's like at 2003, what the jungle of high school has become. And then it's very illuminating in that way, but I found it so innocent compared to today. Like when I think about, like, if you're adding just cell phones alone, let alone the internet barely exists in any meaningful way in 2003 for high schoolers. And now that sort of because there's shootings, like there was the mosque shooting in New Zealand, and that whole thing was live streamed. He was wearing like a camera on him. And it's that level of, I'm not saying we should have another elephant in 2023 or something like that, but it is I don't want to accuse people of over-politicizing school shootings, because it's nothing but a political issue. But like, I found it very weird, because he uses For Elise, Gus Van Sant. Because that's the main thing. I remember watching, when I went and watched this for this meal, was like, oh God, 2003 Elephant. I remember Elephant. But then it's actually good. It's actually like, this is the only song that is appropriate. It's not cliche. It's like, this is kind of, I need you to understand that was an average, Littleton was an average high school by every metric. And yeah, as it pertains to especially Oñate, it gave me this weird, because America's not unique to like spree violence, but we do have that weird form of like colonial, like manifest destiny, and that's a little bit of what like school shootings are, because it's like,
that's an interesting take. Like
in a serial killer way, they do that in the shadows, and they do that for the various reasons, but like spree killing inherently is like, I'm going to crest this hill, and anything over the hill is either a combative force towards me, even if it's not, well, it never is, but like, I'm going to dominate that and do that for whatever reason. It's like a weird impulse.
But so it's like, it kind of begs the question, so the Oñate statue, for example, we kind of nowadays think should perhaps not be in public, because that kind of, it elevates the ethos of that person as something that should be remembered or should be kind of prized, I guess. Nowadays, like, I studied journalism at some point in my culinary life, and it's pretty much par for the course now that most newspapers and most journalists, when another spree shooting happens, they're not focusing on the person who did it. So if you look at 1999 news footage of Columbine, or even we're talking Virginia Tech,
Yeah.
7 or 8 years later, whatever, a lot of the news coverage was about the people. Why did Eric Harris do this? You know, why, how could this possibly happen? And now we generally think that of like, this is part of the reason that this happens so often is because we're almost not idolizing, but we're kind of holding them onto this like attention pedestal.
Yeah.
And so they're trying to take away that attention pedestal. So is Elephant itself an attention pedestal that potential spree killers could hold up as like a, you know, this is a sympathetic view of these two people, like this is almost, you know, motivating me? And I don't know the answer to that question. I would be interested to see what you thought.
Yeah, I think it's a double-edged sword, because I 1,000% agree that there's like an attention aspect to it on a very macro level of people don't feel seen and heard and like they can affect their environment, and this is a way that some percentage does it, and that's, you know, obscene and terrible, and so you neuter them in that way, that it's not going to keep happening for the attention aspect. But then with anything, my only like reservation on that is like the Vietnam thing, where Vietnam is so insanely televised compared to previous conflicts, and that's kind of what helps turn the tide super quickly on it. Whereas again, exact same time, we're growing up, 99 Columbine happens, 2001 we're at 9/11, and then by 2003 we're in the Iraq War, and they have this kind of like understood stance. No photos of coffins with flags over them, no like graphic anything about the war. And so I agree almost completely that like it's obscene and it's torture porn, whatever, because you're you're capitalizing on a pointlessly random chaotic event of like a tragedy. But then there's that 1% of like, this is the way to remove it from that. It's too much about Columbine. I agree. If it was a more generic whatever, I would think it's good. If like, parents, here's what your kids are going through. But I think it's just, unless you're all working without a paycheck and doing it for a good cause, it's really hard to justify, because we see it a little bit today. I'm spreading awareness and I'm spreading awareness. We're aware of just about everything. We don't need people spreading this much awareness. And yeah, in 2003, I would commend him to a degree, but it's hard to take any definitive stance. Yeah, I think on Elephant. Yeah.
It's hard for me too. I completely agree. And as we're talking about this, one of the things that I'm realizing is, you know, looking at it through the lens of journalism and how it's received today, granted everything that has taken place, one of the big things that I'm seeing, big changes that I'm seeing in journalism now, just as a consumer of journalism, is the importance of naming the victims, and whether that's victims of police violence, whether that's victims of a school shooting, or victims of a major catastrophe or accident. Like we touched on this in the last one, is the names that are important. And throughout the film, when each character comes up, you get a name for them. I mean, it's Michelle, and just by Michelle having a name, and you seeing her face and kind of understanding this pain that she's feeling, that we all witnessed in high school. I mean, the scene, she's sitting on the bench, and it's that same bokeh effect. She's completely in focus, and sort of dully in the background, you hear these girls ridiculing her for wearing granny panties.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
It hurts. You're like, oh, God damn it. I was in a locker room and I witnessed that kind of shit go on.
Yeah.
And it's a knife, and it's like, that is important now. There's there's this Ai WeiWei piece where there were these victims, these children that died in this school that collapsed in China. It was a state-built school not structurally sound, had not gone through the proper, engineering and review process. School collapsed, the kids died, and the government tried to keep all of the children's names secret. And he found the names of all of these children, and he printed them full scale on this wall for everyone to see. And that was the important part of it. And the other thing that I think about, the shooters in this story, in this Gus Van Sant interpretation of Columbine, they didn't get names like the other characters did. I don't think did they?
I think it's like they don't get their own like attention in that sense.
No, not in that same way. They're there, and you kind of come to know them anyways, but they don't receive the same. So yeah, it is hard to take a stance, but it's like, if I'm looking for like why the Oñate statue, why in the same way, why this film? Because it's hard for anybody. It's if you're a member of the Acoma Pueblo and you see another Juan de Oñate statue, it has the same cutting effect that watching a film like this has. If this was something that happened in your community, it sort of burns and seethes a little bit.
And I think because you bring up humanity as a general way to tie all of these in, that humanity, when you say that a work of art has humanity, typically it's either like the very, very best or the very, very worst. And like I remember, it's almost, I don't want to say become a negative word, but as we need to choose who we humanize and don't humanize. Because I remember, I don't like Donald Trump. I'll make that very clear. Like, I think he's a bottom five president in American history. But I remember he went on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, and it was this big controversial thing because they accused Fallon of humanizing Trump. And it was this, okay, well, wait a minute.
Giving a platform argument.
Yes. And I think, because there was a controversial movie, 2007, I think, called Downfall, about Hitler's last, week in the bunker, and it was controversial, I think, to anyone that didn't see it, of why on earth are we doing this? But when you watch it, it's, I would argue, the point and nuance of history that gets lost in a statue or lost in works where you're trying to overly politicize it. You see Hitler as a guy, because he was a guy. He was a baby, and then he was a kid, and then he was a teen, and then he was a guy doing this. And so as uncomfortable as it might make you in the audience, that, his genetic makeup is 100% identical to yours, basically. And so that idea of, I think that Elephant does a good job of that, of humanizing the high school. I think it's sloppy in the way that, exactly like you're saying, with because Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold they are the perpetrators of Columbine, but they are themselves some victim of the giant machine of society that they're in, that they were pushed to that. It's their responsibility how they acted, because everyone is pushed in the exact same sort of ways. But when it comes to Oñate, same sort of thing. He didn't have to massacre those people. He chose to do that. That was a choice over the line. And so in the same way, do we make an Oñate movie? Do we glorify him or honor him with the fact of a movie? I would argue yes, if you depict that. Here's the scene where he brings the pigs into whatever, and then here's the scene for 15 minutes where he kills everyone.
Ooh.
And not... It's tricky, because I do think it's tastefully done in the way that he doesn't glorify it, but yeah, there's exactly what you're saying, because that I resonated with her in the locker room, being made fun of, and she's just... Then that teacher in the library is happy to see her, and it's oh, she finally gets to be in this school, the place that she wants to be. And that's the worst possible place for it to happen. Is when it comes to all of these dishes together, you mentioned Ai WeiWei, and it's actually a extreme coincidence, I would argue. I do have 3 of his photos here, original photos, and I'm thinking that would make a pretty... This has been a heavy dish, a very nutrient-filled dish, but it's very heavy.
There's a lot of carbohydrates in this one.
Yeah, so maybe this isn't quite sugary, but maybe this will give a bit of air to the meal. So I think we have a potential for a good 3-piece here. These dishes could go together pretty well, because you bring up Ai WeiWei specifically, and I have 3 of his photographs here. But in order to maybe, how much do you guys know about Ai WeiWei, the artist?
He's from China.
Yeah.
Very notably, yes, very good. Well, he was born in 1957. His father was a poet, and he was exiled before the Cultural Revolution. So, Cultural Revolution, I'll get into it, but it's this big tumultuous event in China. And so he's exiled before even any of that. He's sort of politically
The
purged.
father.
Yeah. And so in the 70s, the family's sort of been rehabilitated back into the limelight there in China. Ai WeiWei attended the Beijing Film Academy with an emphasis on animation. And then he traveled to the U.S. and lived in New York City. He met other artists like Allen Ginsberg, poets and people from other mediums. And America really awakened his creativity in a new way, because at this point, China is definitively pretty third world. Like it's still a very, very developing country. And to go to New York in the 70s, I guess he wouldn't have been intimidated by how dangerous that would have been at the time. But like free thought encouraged everywhere all the time. Like whatever you can do, go ahead and do it. And we want to see it. So he went back to China in the 90s, and he started trying to help artistic communities there, because China really struggles to get like groups of people, like schools of thought and artistic philosophies like ingrained there. They have very good artists, but they're never usually like communities based in Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong. So it takes a while to get things going. So he makes a name for himself. Fast forward to 2001. China wins the bid to host the 2008 Olympics. And for us, it's like, oh, great, we get to host that, build a new stadium, do whatever. For China, this was like a point of national pride that you couldn't even, it's almost incomparable to any other moment in the last like 100 years of finally, after 300 years of clawing our way back up from the Qing dynasty declining, we are now back. We are part of the global community.
Somebody's taking us seriously again for the first time in a while.
Yes, exactly. And so the eyes of the world, they couldn't get people to pay attention to them before, or in the way that they wanted them to pay attention to them. So in 1.5 billion people's eyes, they had finally been recognized as like, we're not just Chinese, we're people. And so here's our chance to show our culture to the world. So every Olympic Games needs a massive stadium, and China's an insanely massive country population-wise. And so the government contracted a Swiss architecture firm to build it, but they were very insistent that a Chinese person design it. And so they had Ai WeiWei design it. And the result is the Beijing National Stadium, also known as the Bird's Nest, which is this beautiful venue. I've been there 2 or 3 times, and it's just impossible to like fathom how they constructed that thing. It's incredible. And it's called the Bird's Nest because that's what it looks like. All of these randomly twisted spires everywhere. But a year before that, before it was even finished, Ai WeiWei had already divorced himself from the project, sort of denounced the government and anyone involved in the '08 Olympics. He was Steven Spielberg at that time was attached to help direct the opening ceremonies, and he was, shame on you. And so Steven Spielberg quit. This was the most high-profile anti-government like statement in a while. Like we have the world's eyes on us, and now the designer of our flagship building is saying this is bad and we shouldn't be here and the Olympics are bad. And so later in the early 2010s, 2011, he was arrested at the airport for a myriad of reasons, but they claim like tax, financial sort of stuff. So these 3 photos that I would like to set on the table, that's our artist. To give the context behind these 3 photos, in the 1960s, China went through the Cultural Revolution. And to any other country, that's like just a way of describing like the 60s or whatever. Here would be a cultural revolution.
Little different in China.
Tiny bit different. The capital letters to say Cultural Revolution. So the government, specifically Mao Zedong and the Red Guard, denounced what was known as the 4 olds, meaning elements of pre-communist China that should be destroyed. So these would be old ideas, old cultures, old habits, and old customs. And the Red Guard were basically paramilitary student groups that would go around trying to destroy these 4 olds under the philosophy that in order to create a new society, that space must be carved out of the old society. They can't both coexist. And so this was like somewhat tolerated at the time by the citizens of China, but since then and since, it's kind of regarded as a disaster. Like the country was on the brink of civil war, the entire thing almost imploded. So in modern China, you have two camps of people of Ai WeiWei's age, like people who were around at the founding of the country or their kids, that the Cultural Revolution was a mistake, but we have learned it from our mistakes and we are now going to try to move on. And the other camp says the Cultural Revolution was such a failure of the government that they have lost their credibility to govern. You can't have the communist government because they invalidated that gubernatorial authority, I guess. And so Ai WeiWei clearly belongs to the second, where he is pretty anti-communist, pretty anti-Chinese government. And he set out to make this artistic statement in 1995, where he took these 3 very provocative photographs, together known as dropping a Han Dynasty Urn, in which Ai WeiWei holds and drops a 2,000-year-old vase, smashing it into pieces on the ground. And the funny part about this is he actually did it twice. Like, this isn't the only time. He smashed 2 urns, and the first one didn't work because they didn't get a good enough photo of it. But why?
I know how that goes.
I mean, yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Why I bring this?
Got to break some eggs to make an omelet.
Yeah, you got to break some urns to whatever. Yeah. Disillusion 1.5 billion people. So, yeah, why I bring this is sort of similar to how we discussed with the Oñate piece. Is Ai WeiWei is a bit of I have conflicted thoughts on him as an artist, because he's a little 75% of what he does I think is great and very provocative and very thought-provoking, but then 25% of it is a bit of that he points his finger at the Chinese government and says, I'm not touching you, kind of like annoying, like I'm going to do just whatever I want just because you're not going to publicly assassinate me, kind of thing. Dropping a Han Dynasty Urn is sort of, I think, to describe it as punk rock is a bit ineloquent, but it's China has this adherence to their 4,000-year-old history that really only India can also claim as like we are one of the original civilizations. And they do that through holding on to things, as you described, these heirlooms from their ancestors, and choosing to define themselves by that. And so that got them into such trouble that they then thought, okay, we need to destroy all of this and start China again and anew. And that doesn't really actually work, because people have a lineage. There is a story. You can't just erase the path behind you. But in dropping these urns, it sort of hits in a way that I can only compare. In America, we talk about burning the flag, and we talk about burning the flag as a representation of free speech. The equivalent would be if we torched if like the Liberty Bell or whatever, we decided to throw that into the ocean. It's not even a human being statue. It's something emblematic of what we feel we are. The Han Dynasty, they feel this is China. This is when the people who lived here finally became China, is the Han Dynasty. So what, I guess, in your guys' experience with Ai WeiWei or these photographs, I guess, how did it strike you to see an artist smashing another artist's work, essentially?
That's a great question. I am an Ai WeiWei fan, and I haven't per se followed him for that long, but he's one of those people that when you consume his artwork and you see the work that he's doing and the kind of outreach that goes along with the pieces that he does, he is not only a craftsman in the way that he works with porcelain, wood, stone, and these other mediums that are like really traditionally Chinese. So he uses these methods that have been, these methods and crafts that have been passed down through his culture for generations, and he uses them in a way that are provocative. And it's hard for me not to just be a super fan, just a total fanboy of the things that he does. And it's because it really ends up being, an effort to bring recognition and awareness to groups of people that have been oppressed, not only the Chinese. He's stood by other groups of refugees and people who've been outcast or sort of, disenfranchised or, what have you. So to watch him, to see that progression of the photos, I think one of the things that you notice in it, his face doesn't change. There's so much indifference there that it is this clear message of I feel nothing by doing this, which is so bold. It is punk rock. I mean, that is essentially what it is. And so my reaction to that is, as someone who does value art in the sense that I think about the art that we have in North America that reminds us of cultures that have been here for a long time. And it's like, I can't dream of doing something like that. Like, you go to the Field Museum in Chicago and you see pieces of pottery that were created by ancestral people from the Southwest and, around the Grand Canyon, Mesa Verde, Canyons of the Ancients. And they find these beautiful examples of work. And it's something that if I were to come across it hiking, I would, one, you're supposed to leave it, but these, they're collected for places like the Field Museum so that people can appreciate them. And it's something that it's really hard, it's like, while I love Ai WeiWei, in the same way, when you walk through that exhibit of early peoples in like the Field Museum in Chicago, for example, you realize how they made everything and everything has a hand on it. And it's so that's what gives those photos even more weight, is like that there is value. It's not that somebody put a price on it or anything like that. It is valuable. It's from a time when we made everything with our hands.
And so to kind of go off on a similar tangent, I suppose. So like you made the metaphor about the Liberty Bell, throwing the Liberty Bell in the river or the ocean or whatever. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's quite the same thing because so originally learning about this piece, I was like, well, where did he get this? Where did he even get the urns to begin with, right? And he told a story of he was taking a trip in the 90s, Ai WeiWei, mm-hmm. And he was in a city called Xi'an, and there was like a street dude, like either a street merchant or a beggar or something, who had one of these like Han Dynasty urns and was trying to sell it for like a very small amount of Chinese yuan. And nobody would buy it from him. Nobody gave a single fuck about this Han Dynasty urn. So I really think it's not destroying something that the government thought was like specifically very, very important. I think he was really making a point with this piece that he was destructing this. And like destructing isn't a word.
That's fine.
Destroying is what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
Destroy. He's destroying this thing that is like completely, basically meaningless to the Chinese government, and they pretend like it matters to them, but like in the same fashion, it really doesn't. And the same, so for example, like the city of Shenzhen in the south of China was just a fishing village, right? Like this old fishing village that went back so many thousands of years, and then China's like, well, we want to build a mega city here, so they just demolished the entire thing and just started from scratch. So it's like, we do the same thing. We do the same thing in America. We do the same thing in a lot of places where it's like we're demolishing a lot of culturally important things like it's nothing.
Yeah.
It's interesting too. I think that's a really interesting perspective, and both of you have said things now that I'm kind of rocking back on my heels, and I'm like, that's because one of the arguments for the Cultural Revolution in the beginning, correct me if I'm wrong here, is that we have to make space for the new society inside of the old one. So there is sort of this necessary destruction for things to grow anew, and I think he communicates that in these photos personally.
I mean, Yeah, because like in that exact same way that both of you are saying, like China is very, not even like internationally, domestically, forgery and sort of creating fake merchandise, even for just travelers from, like you're saying, Shenzhen to Beijing. They don't care if the souvenir is a fake, actual whatever. They'll pay for it because it represents whatever. There is also like the, not truly conspiracy theory, but there is a theory that these are just forged like urns, and then it becomes exactly what you're saying, where are we all of a sudden projecting value onto something that inherently doesn't have that value? And then the macro argument to that is like, well, isn't that actually all art? Like if there was whatever sort of acid rain damaged Greco-Roman statue out there that's unearthed, and we now assign, like there's a turf war over it between Turkey and Greece, this sort of arbitrary thing, because in the exact way that you described Shenzhen is there because it's so close to Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is this, well, Hong Kong is definitely Chinese. Well, Hong Kong was a fishing village on the rocks for thousands of years. Britain takes it by force, somewhat unjustly, mostly unjustly, builds it into the economic powerhouse because it's the doormat of China. You can get in, you can launder money through Hong Kong to get it into China. And then the minute that it comes time to signing it away, or the current troubles we see there now, it's like, oh no, it's Chinese. They all obey tea time and they all speak English and they drive on the opposite side of the road, but it's definitely Chinese. And so it begs this question, because I'm not sure if either of you are aware, in 2014 in Miami, they had an Ai WeiWei exhibit in an art museum down there. And an artist took one of his urns, raised it up, and smashed it as like a protest of, we can't get Miami artists into Miami museums. We don't have room for this. And it's this weird, almost Kanye taking the mic from Taylor moment, where is it an artistic statement to destroy something? Can destruction be just as artistic as creation?
Yes. That is the simplest answer.
Yes. Good night, folks.
I'm gonna elaborate on that. So, okay. I'm gonna start with like a kind of macro piece. All right. Nowadays, the actual print that you have here at A Minor Diner are worth more money, and we're not saying that monetary value is the only value, right? But if we're talking purely monetary, like quote unquote artistic value in that sense, these prints are now worth far more money than a Han Dynasty urn would have been in the first place. So it's kind of interesting. There's the destruction of the piece, but at the same time, it's kind of like the urn is still in an art museum where it would have been, but it's in a different context. And it's almost in a more interesting context, right? Where, like, you could say these Han Dynasty urns are a dime a dozen in the fact that, like, when I go to an art museum, when I go to the Field Museum, there's like that large, the large area with a bunch of pottery, and I think it's really cool for like 2 minutes, and then I'm like, well, I don't know anything about pottery. I want to see some art. I want to see some visual art. Whereas here he's like, okay, he's taking this thing and he's making it a new piece of art that's almost, I don't know, like, I don't want to say more interesting, but it's almost more interesting. He's just like he's repurposing the art and making it something different, in my opinion, more so than destroying it.
Interesting. And then how would you feel, because that's very provocative, like the repurposing, recontextualizing approach as it pertains to Elephant or Oñate. Like, what if you were to do we have the right to depict Oñate a bit more sinister than he actually was in statue form in order to make that commentary? But also, would Elephant be like a recontextualizing or a repurposing of what we would call a sacred event, of like an untouchable event? Is there like because why I bring these, and in case it isn't very clear to the diners here, photograph number 1, Ai WeiWei's holding this urn, and these are all black and white. Photograph number 2, the urn is in midair because he's dropped it. Photograph number 3, it's in pieces on the ground, and like you guys said, same stoic sort of defiant stare down the camera lens. Is there art that's too? Is the what do I want to get at here? Like is the intrinsic message or theme or purpose of the art? Is there something so sacred that 10,000 years from now, if someone wants to repurpose Michelangelo's David, can they do that?
Potentially. I think that like when was the last time that, I mean, if you think about the film, if you think about Elephant, if you think about the Juan de Oñate statue, when was the last time that anybody really stopped to notice or even care about the statue until you see it in the news being pulled on by citizens, and then someone shows up to the scene like they did this past year when, you know, this whole thing came back and these protesters show up to not only tear down the statue, but then there were also people who showed up to defend it. Mm-hmm. And so now it becomes like what you were saying earlier, this chess piece alone. It's just what it is. It really has no value. And then you kind of add this, you add this energy to it. You add the second half of the recipe, I guess, Ai WeiWei in this case, and it becomes something even bigger. So I think a lot of art has that potential. A lot of art by itself is so ordinary. It can be easily stripped of its meaning. Of an urn, it can be sort of decontextualized. It can be stuffed away in a store and lose all of its quote unquote value when it's sort of taken out of context, and that its only value, the only value that it has is the value that someone gives it.
And there's an Ai WeiWei quote that is exactly the same thing that you just said. WeiWei, a quote from him about this piece. It says, "It, as in any piece of art, it's powerful only because someone thinks it's powerful and invests value in the object." It's worth like so your example with David, because we've got these countless number of years where we have invested so much value in David, I would say that it is almost heretical to do something to it, to paint like eyelashes on it or something. Sure. And have like this is a LGBTQ statement. Yeah. I would say that would be against the art law. But if we're taking something that didn't necessarily, it had some meaning, but people weren't treating it like it did, I think it's totally valid in my opinion. And
there's because that's a good point both of you make. That it reminds me, there's, to give a quick shout out, there's a cinematographer, Luke Askelson. We went to film school together. He made this short film called Life of a Pot. And it's sort of, I think, if I could get a takeaway from what you guys are saying, is that art, it doesn't necessarily need to be one thing, but if it's living, breathing, fluid, that's the more resonant, eternal art, if it can survive changes of context. Because he was making, it's a documentary, 5-minute documentary of him making a pot. And there's something very, when it comes to sculpture or 3D art in that way, there is a living, breathing, you have to massage the pot to get it to look the way it does. And he works on it so delicately and with such detail for about 5 minutes. And then it cuts to a shot of him outside the building, wherever the urn or the kiln where he fried it there, and then just drops it on the ground and it smashes everywhere, and then he walks away. And I remember 80% of the people in the film school were so appalled by that, and I just thought it was the greatest thing ever, and why we would work together. But yeah, it's sort of I forgot the piece of art. Elephants, not just Elephant the movie, but elephants themselves are somewhat close to human beings in terms of intelligence and empathy, and they're observed to have buried their dead. And so to that same degree, if they're making markings and having funerals for elephants, whereas you don't have that with fish. Fish don't care when another one dies, and they don't leave any sort of marking. That is an interesting way that you frame David, because it makes me think there's this YouTube channel of this like elephant sanctuary in Thailand, and they play them Beethoven on the pianos, and the elephants have no idea what to make of it, but they love it. And it's one of these like weird, how does that work? Like, how did they draw the cultural whatever? But then they will also give them paintbrushes, like they sometimes do at zoos here in America, and sell paintings that elephants have done on canvases. And it's, I guess, not that it has an answer, but I would pose the question to you guys that if Ai WeiWei basically takes the material that someone else's artistic completed work is just his starting material, just his palette to then take a picture of, is there anything that would ever be too reverential on an intrinsic, like, human being level, like regardless of time and space, 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years from now? Is there something that someone could do that would be too personal to then recontextualize? That's
a great question. I think what we've been saying is that adding layers of life to these objects, and Ai WeiWei does that with a lot of the pieces. He's known for kind of some of his ready-made pieces, and for people who aren't familiar with sculpture art as much, you know, if you're creating an artwork with ready-made materials, you're using things that already exist with their own purpose. You're creating something larger out of traffic cones, or, you know, he uses stools. You know, there's these ways that you can combine and sort of twist or repurpose sections of reinforced concrete pipe. All these examples of this, but the layers of time that are added to something add to that story. And I'm not sure, you know, what it would be that it would be so sacred that we could not pave over it or change it or recontextualize it in some way, because I start thinking of, you know, what is the future of Columbine High School?
Yep.
What happens to that structure? Is it important to recontextualize that? Can we give it new meaning in the ways that we modify the architecture to tell story about the victims and the perpetrators? Can we restructure the landscape there to, you know, because I know that there was a period of time where, you know, it was that was in question a lot. It may still be, you know, what to do with the building itself, because it's like anybody who's buying a house and someone has, you know, there maybe was some brutal murder committed in the house, it's haunted essentially after that. You know, it changes the value of it in a way that is seen as negative, and that, you know, we really shouldn't step back on these are kind of hallowed grounds in that, you know, morbid sense. But it's important to push ourselves to think through those problems, because you cannot keep something the same forever. And I think of that often in the sense that there are two sort of different ways of thinking about this, and to oversimplify them, I think there's a lot of Native American cultures that look at our lives as sort of fleeting and cyclical, and that they don't necessarily keep things the same way that maybe Anglo-Americans do. We try to preserve things. We give value to something that in a way that it'll never change. Mm-hmm. I think there's one specific site in Colorado that is so important to this specific area's like cultural history and tourism industry. It's the Crystal Mill down by Marble, Colorado. Yeah. The area has lots of history in the sense that there was marble quarried there to build monuments in DC, monuments in Denver. And then there's this cool old mill clinging to the cliffs, and it has been bolted and cabled and reinforced and suspended for a couple of decades now. That if you were to have never done those things, if the local Chamber of Commerce said like, yeah, no, let it go, it would have fallen into the Crystal River ages ago. People would not come to visit Marble to take pictures of the Crystal Mill. You know, it's like but it has to change at some point. It's like, even that, we cannot keep it forever. It's sacred, but yeah.
And I mean, even outside of like human civilization, I was recently in Arches National Park in Utah, And same thing where these arches, I mean, they are a completely natural phenomenon, but even these natural outside of human life phenomenon they're cyclical and they don't last forever. Like arches fall down, they're gone forever. And it goes back to the statue argument that it's like, is anything, like nothing is forever. That's just like it's the idea that we want it to be forever because we think it's important. But I don't know. I was recently at my dad's house and found buried under a ton of books. I found like hundreds and hundreds of like pieces of paper that I used to draw comics all the time in like middle school. And then we're talking 15 years after the fact, right? I've found all of these papers and it's like, well, am I going to keep these? Like, and maybe I keep a few of them, but like, it's bizarre because I feel like now, 15 years down the fact, again, I can't talk today, after the fact, I feel like they almost have more meaning to me now than they did when I originally made them in middle school, because it's like, oh well, now this is like a pinpoint of my past. Like this is something I almost have to hold on to or else it's lost, like memories, like all these memories that we've lost over the years. But in the end, like these were things that honestly I did every single day when I was in 7th grade, and they didn't mean that much to me then.
Right.
So
yeah, and I think that that's a very because that's almost, I guess, the philosophical argument of art is like, do you hold on to it because it has value, or are you clinging to something and not destroying it because it'd be better to destroy it? Because I know exactly what you mean of finding old drawings or papers that I wrote from like 2nd grade whenever you go to your parents' house, and like half of the time it unlocks something in me of like, oh, that is my identity, because that's what I felt at 7, and I didn't realize I still believe that at 27. But then the other half is like, okay, imagine if I did have that all 20 years, that it wasn't swept under the rug. It's like, oh, I'm like, oh, I need to cling to this identity that whatever I thought at 7. And it becomes more applicable as you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, that you're trying to shed but also maintain who you actually are. And so maybe it does make sense that Michelangelo's David does pivot to something else, because it's been used as like a white supremacist Christian hierarchy sort of thing. And so maybe it does get repurposed to some other thing. But yeah, that's a very interesting, because especially you bring up Columbine, because that was like a very big community national issue for a while, is the library. Of like, we can do whatever we want to this school. We can't bulldoze the school, but what are we going to do about the library? And the argument forever was like, that's where the memorial is. We do this in there, we do that in there, because it's above the cafeteria. And so there's a lot of general architectural problems with it. But then eventually moved that off-site. It's still on the campus, the memorial, but then they just don't have the library anymore. They tore that out, walled it up. And then you get the opposite. And obviously not that it's a work of art, but at Parkland, the building that happened in was building 12. And so it wasn't like it was a school-wide thing. He just went into that one thing. It's very, very morbid. Just learned about it like the other day. Because of, this isn't an indictment on the American judicial system, but they need to preserve evidence. And so that has been on lockdown and kept at 55 degrees since it happened. They put up fences around it. It's locked and chained up and everything. But like, it's a preserved crime scene from like 4 years ago now. And it's this weird thing that kids going into that school see every day. And it's one of those, that's like an obvious, egregious, I think anyone would agree, we bulldozed that building because it doesn't need to be there. But then there are things like, eventually, what do you do with Rushmore? Because Rushmore can't be there forever, especially when we get to 75 presidents. Why are these for? And then do we just keep building them down the mountain, this sacred Native American mountain? It becomes, I guess, off the top of your heads, not that there's an answer, when do you think that moment, it was clearly 2,000 years later that he drops the urn. When do you, is it like a couple generations later that it's safe and free to recontextualize something?
I think that's so impossible to answer because it matter, like it just completely depends on the piece of art to begin with, right? I think like the metaphorical dropping the urn, I mean, so to go back to the Oñate statue, we're trying to drop that urn now. We're trying to drop a lot of these statues' urns. Elephant came out 20 years ago, and based on that conversation, like all three of us are kind of unsure if this urn needs to exist anymore. But there are some things that I would say like, oh, well, these are worth holding on to. These are important. Like, we're not ready to drop this urn yet, but
There's something interesting to watch there, though, because that element of time and the effect that it has on a piece is a medium in itself.
Right.
And there are a lot of artists, and I think Ai WeiWei makes good use of that. And there is another artist that uses time as the natural force that it is. I mean, anything with time changes. The notes that you dug out from under all of your books that you had, written in middle school, they're so valuable to you now. It's like the only thing that changed was time. And the arch in Canyonlands, it's like time is the artist there. It sculpts it. Mount Rushmore, the only thing that they tried to change there was, well, let's build Crazy Horse too, and never finish it.
Yeah.
Consequently, which is even sadder, kind of a thing where it's like, wow, this is beautiful, and it was, had the best, but it just. It does change. So like when you ask, with like there's this element, there's Ai WeiWei dropping the vase. It's like that even has natural forces working on it, and that is sort of getting away from. That is sort of getting away from the politics of it. It's getting away from the meaning that these things have, and it is this reminder that there's this overarching element that is completely out of our control, because we can bring these things into being, but then they are inevitably at the mercy of time and everything that starts to shape it. So with whether it's the film or the statue or Mount Rushmore, I think that one of my favorite examples of this is Andy Goldsworthy. He's a sculpture artist from the UK, and he uses natural found materials, and he spends hours sort of arranging them into these beautiful structures and patterns, and films them basically disintegrating and being taken away by the current or the breeze or the changing temperature of the day. And it's just like, that's what it is. I mean, he sold a print of, he laid an icicle on a piece of paper that had sand and mud trapped in it. It melted, and he framed it and put it in a gallery kind of thing. And you're like, there it is,
And one of my favorite ambient pieces of all time, William Basinski, the Disintegration tapes, where he's just got this like recording that he's just looping again and again, and as it continues to loop, it's disintegrating, it's dying in front of him. And I don't know. I think that's like it makes it more powerful than it was to begin with. Like this recontextualization actually like fills it with more artistic merit, in my sense. Yeah.
Right. And so I would say, like, as a takeaway from, I think that it's like, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but you wait till that baby grows up, and then you can drop it out into the bathwater. And I think
you keep that baby in there, and its fingers start to do the little thing.
Yeah, it grows up. There's a womb metaphor in there somewhere, but like, and not that we think that you are a baby, Drew, but we will metaphorically. It is getting late. We could throw you out into the bathwater of our parking lot, and we can. We've loved having you here, though. I mean, this is. I don't know where we're gonna put the statue, but we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Can you please take that with you, because we don't. Our trash bill is already sky high.
I don't know when the large item pickup day is, but anyways, thank you. It's so good to see you guys. I can't believe this is your restaurant. I mean, this is such a great place, and I mean, thank you for commissioning this mural from me. It's been great to share this time with you.
What is the mural of, if you don't mind me asking, on the side of our building?
So, well, it's an abstraction. And now that we're talking about what's like, okay, I have this statue, we're talking about recontextualizing things. I have all these thoughts running through my head. What does, what is the story of this building? What was it before it was A Minor Diner? Is that an important part of what we talk about here? Is it a blend of music and food and culture? So I'm thinking of kind of this abstraction. There's a severed boot. There's shards of an urn, and kind of this landscape of change happening there, and it has this resonance to it and this music. So I mean that's
like, quick request though. Could you put an elephant in there as well?
Oh yeah, of course,
okay.
an elephant.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I quick story about elephants. I love elephants.
That was a great story.
I mean, like the whole time I'm kind of keep thinking, I'm like hoping I'm watching this movie. I'm like, where is the elephant? I was like, waiting for it to like, oh yeah, they're having the field day or whatever.
At the zoo, field trip.
Like, oh cool. And then there's the elephant is there, and it becomes an integral. We'd go to the Denver Zoo, and we'd get there, and I was fascinated by elephant poop. And so I would ask my parents, like, let's go to the elephant exhibit. We gotta see them, and just marvel at them. They're massive. And so anyways, I had my favorite stuffed animal. This is great too, because when you said you dug out these drawings from when you were a kid, my cousin Brooke, she made me, I was probably 5, she made me handmade an elephant, and I named it Tusky. And I wrote her a thank you where I colored it in with crayons, and I drew a picture of an elephant, and I mailed it to her, and she found it. She dug it out when I was at her house, and it was this. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool, because a couple years ago I was working with Rock Yard, and they wanted this, where the character developed for an amber ale, and we kind of went through all of these iterations and storytelling with elephants, and I wanted to call the beer Tusky, and I put an elephant on it, and it's red, and it's just like, elephants, they're really, a part of my artistic makeup a little bit. So yeah, we will get an elephant in there for sure.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, to add a minor epilogue or an afterword from a different author to your story,
okay.
You had a work of art from your early childhood that you brought into high school, if you remember, the Animal book.
Oh, yes.
Yes. So I'd be very curious to see what this, because I remember that was pretty, and respectfully so, demented story that you were a lot of skeletons, and it was a pretty dark thing for a elementary school kid to depict. So I'd be curious what your elephant that elephant versus the one on the side of our giant wall here. Yeah,
certainly. I knew from a young age, this is before I'd listened to any David Attenborough, nature is dark. I mean, there is some heavy metal going on just in the natural world without anybody watching. It's fascinating. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So that we don't go another 20 years without making contact, where can we get in touch with you?
Oh yeah. So reach out to me through my website, www.dbuttoninc.com. You can follow me on Instagram at dbuttoninc. D as in dog, button like on your shirt, ink like from a pen. So you can reach out to me there. You can give me a phone call. I think you've got my number. I should give you guys my number after this.
We'll keep that. We won't distribute that.
Totally. Let's meet back here on the patio and of course.
Well, it was lovely to see you. And come back anytime. Enjoy the pool.
We
Thank you so much.